The glass in my hand trembled. Though I prayed, no one noticed. Madeline's voice carried easily over the clink of forks and the polite laughter of her colleagues. "We don't need your opinion, Mom." It wasn't said with venom, not even with heat, just casual dismissal, as if my thoughts were clutter on her polished dining table. Her guests chuckled politely, and I forced my lips into the kind of smile one uses to hide a bruise. I lowered my eyes to the fruit tart I had brought, the same recipe Madeline once begged for on her birthdays. Now it sat untouched beside mimosa flutes and glossy catered dishes. I excused myself to the kitchen, set my plate down carefully, and walked out to the patio for air. Beyond the neatly trimmed hedges, Raleigh's late spring sun glared as if daring me to blink back the sting in my eyes. When brunch finally ended, I kissed Eli's forehead, his small face warm against mine, and slipped out before anyone could notice my silence. The drive home wound through neighborhoods I had once known as fields when Jonathan was alive. He had helped design half the roadways in this part of Wake County, his mark hidden in every intersection. I passed them now like gravestones, reminders of a man who built permanence while I held only fragments. At a red light, I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered before pressing Jonathan's will and trust, the number still saved as it had been when he first drafted it. The attorney's voicemail picked up, steady and professional. I spoke slowly, my voice firmer than I expected. "This is Lorena Kincaid. I need to make a change." By the time I turned into my driveway, the decision had already taken root, leading me back to the promise I once made beside his grave. I can still feel the weight of that afternoon in Oakwood Cemetery, the air heavy with late summer heat and magnolia blossoms already browning at the edges. I was 27, dressed in borrowed black, holding Madeline's hand as she clung to me, wide-eyed and bewildered. Jonathan's coffin rested beneath the oaks, and when the minister's voice broke on the word sudden, I thought my own breath might stop with his. After the crowd dispersed, I stayed. Madeline's small fingers curled into my palm, sticky from the lollipop someone had pressed into her hand. I bent close to the grave and whispered the promise I carried for decades. I would raise our daughter with dignity. She would never feel the sharp edge of scarcity or shame. Whatever it cost me, I would see her through. That vow became my compass. I took on tutoring sessions after long school days, staying up late over Shakespeare essays while Madeline slept in the next room. Summers, while others traveled. I taught enrichment programs at NC State to keep the savings growing. Vacations were luxuries I learned to forget. Each sacrifice stitched another thread into the fabric of her future. When Georgetown accepted her, we cried together at the kitchen table. I sold my grandmother's wedding ring, an heirloom passed down 3 generations, to help cover her dorm costs. Madeline never asked me to, but she didn't stop me either. She hugged me so tightly that night I thought she understood what it meant. For years, I believed I was both mother and anchor. She sent postcards from D.C., signed "Love you more than words." I carried them in my purse like talismans, proof that my promise was being kept, proof that Jonathan's absence had not been in vain. Yet standing in her home decades later, silenced at her table, I realized the vow I made at his grave had carried me into a place I no longer recognized, and so I began to wonder if keeping it had cost me more than I could afford, leading me toward the quiet erasure that had already begun. It happened so quietly that I almost missed it. 1 year, Thanksgiving was too hectic, and they went to Napa with Connor's colleagues. Christmas, Madeline said, would be just the 3 of us this year. But I later saw photos online, balloons, caterers, unfamiliar faces crowded around the tree. I told myself it was work, timing, convenience. But each holiday that passed without an invitation carved out another hollow inside me. Even Eli's milestones became places where I no longer belonged. I used to sit in the front row at his school assemblies, clapping until my palms stung. Then one afternoon, I arrived to find Connor's mother in my seat, waving proudly while Eli scanned the crowd. Madeline hadn't told me she'd invited someone else. She simply smiled afterward and said, "It was easier this way. I carried a bag of homemade soup once when Eli had the flu." I rang the bell, waiting for footsteps, but no one came. Later, I received a text. "Thanks. Mom, left it on the porch. Right. Appreciate it." Not an invitation inside, not a chance to sit at the bedside, just a line fit for a neighbor. The final cut came in the smallest gesture. Years ago, Madeline had pressed a spare house key into my hand, saying, "Your family. You should always be able to come home." I kept it on my ring beside Jonathan's old Ford key. One morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with the key inside. No note, no explanation, just the weight of metal stripped of meaning. Our conversations thinned into transactions. "Can you pick Eli up Tuesday? Do you still have that casserole dish? What's the Wi-Fi password at your house?" The warmth drained until there was nothing left but utility. I tried to recall the sound of her laughter when she was young, the way she once leaned against me on the couch to watch movies. But memory felt like reaching for a photograph that had faded in the sun. I realized then that my role had shifted from essential to optional, and that optional could so easily slide into invisible. And it was in that silence, in that steady shrinking, that I decided the time had come to speak with Evelyn Harper. Evelyn Harper's office sat in a brick building off Fayetteville Street, its windows overlooking the courthouse square. I had walked past it countless times with Jonathan when we came downtown for parades or summer concerts, never imagining I would one day sit across from an oak desk revising the future he left behind. Evelyn greeted me with the quiet warmth of someone who had seen too many families unravel over paper. She opened a folder stamped with Jonathan's name in bold type. Inside was the will he had drafted nearly 20 years ago, before Eli was born, when Madeline was still the center of our world. "Your husband left everything in 2 layers, Evelyn explained gently. Madeline first, Eli second. It was the traditional path-direct line of inheritance. She glanced up at me. "But as executor and surviving spouse, you have full authority to amend. You can realign the distributions to reflect your current wishes." I traced my finger over Jonathan's signature, firm and confident, as if he had just signed it yesterday. My chest tightened at the thought of changing his words. But then I remembered the promise I made at his grave to raise our daughter with dignity. Dignity was not what I felt at her table last week. "This isn't revenge," I said aloud, though Evelyn had not asked for justification. "It's about honoring Jonathan. He believed in work, in respect. If that's no longer reflected in our daughter's life, then I can't pretend his legacy should enable her indifference." Evelyn nodded, her pen poised but patient. "Then let's consider the alternatives." We reviewed possibilities: trusts, charitable designations, conditions for Eli's future. Each option felt like a thread pulled taut, reweaving Jonathan's memory into something sturdier than disappointment. By the time I signed the preliminary papers, my hand was steady. I no longer felt as though I was erasing Jonathan's intentions. I was protecting them. And with that clarity, I knew the next step would be deciding exactly where his legacy and mine should live. The following week, I returned to Evelyn's office with notes scribbled in the margins of a yellow pad. It felt strange to see my handwriting spelling out decisions that would shape lives long after mine was finished. But the words had come to me with certainty. For the first time in years, I felt purposeful. The first matter was the house. Jonathan and I had built our life inside those walls' birthdays. graduations, late-night arguments that ended in laughter. Letting it pass into Madeline's disinterested hands felt like burying him twice. Instead, I asked Evelyn to deed it to a transitional housing nonprofit in Wake County. The idea that our home could shelter women rebuilding their lives gave me comfort, as though Jonathan's steady craftsmanship would outlive both of us. Next came the retirement funds. Jonathan had taught evening seminars at NC State when Madeline was young, believing education could lift anyone willing to reach. I asked Evelyn to divide a portion into scholarships for aspiring teachers, so his passion for building could continue, only this time with classrooms instead of highways. Then we opened the jewelry case. Each piece carried weight far heavier than its appraised value. My mother's pearls, my grandmother's brooch, Jonathan's ring, all of it had lived against skin that carried our history. Most would be auctioned for charity, but one velvet box I reserved for Eli. Inside, I placed a letter, written in careful script, telling him that inheritance was not about possession, but about carrying forward respect, resilience, and kindness. Finally, we shaped the trust. Eli would inherit at 25, but only if he pursued education or a trade. I wanted him to have opportunity, but also to understand that opportunity must be met with effort. Evelyn called it conditional. I called it love with boundaries. When the last signature dried, I closed the folder and sat back. The heaviness I had carried for months eased, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign. I hadn't erased Jonathan's legacy, I had redefined it. And as I walked out into the Raleigh afternoon, I realized that the harder work still lay ahead, learning to live without waiting for permission. The first morning, after signing the new documents, I made coffee in my kitchen and realized I didn't feel the usual ache of waiting for my phone to buzz. Instead, I pulled out a brochure I'd collected months ago and drove downtown to the Raleigh Art Center. The watercolor class met in a bright room with tall windows. My brushstrokes were clumsy, my hands stiff, but when color spread across the page, I felt something stir that had been buried beneath years of errands and compromises. On Tuesdays, I began volunteering at the Wake Literacy Council. I sat with adults struggling to read bus schedules or fill out job applications, and for the first time in years, my teaching skills felt alive again. They looked at me with gratitude, not impatience. I came home tired, but light, as if a new part of myself had been discovered in those quiet hours. Madeline still called, but her requests grew thinner. "Can you pick Eli up Thursday? We're tied up." I would steady my breath and reply, "I can't this week, but maybe ask Connor's mother. She's closer." The silence that followed always carried surprise. I no longer scrambled for excuses or rearranged my life to fit hers. Guilt had once been my constant companion. I wore it like an invisible shawl, believing a good mother never said no. But the more I practiced those small refusals, the lighter I became. Each "I can't" felt less like failure and more like truth. In the evenings, I walked the greenway trails Jonathan once helped design. I listened to the cicadas and felt the rhythm of my own steps steady and sure. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't waiting by the phone. I was living days shaped by choice, not by someone else's permission. It was in that quiet steadiness that Evelyn called to confirm the final date for the will reading, and I knew the time had come for clarity none of us could ignore. Evelyn's office sat in one of the restored brick buildings off Fayetteville Street, its tall windows letting in the hum of downtown Raleigh. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon oil. I arrived first, Judith at my side, steady as always. Moments later, Madeline walked in with Connor, her steps quick, her smile tight. Eli trailed behind, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, eyes darting between us as if he sensed the tension before a word was spoken. We settled around the long table. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and opened the folder. Her voice was calm, practiced, as she read each clause of the amended will. I kept my gaze fixed on the grain of the table as Madeline's name failed to appear. The house redirected to transitional housing. Jonathan's retirement fund reallocated to scholarships. The jewelry divided with only one velvet box reserved for Eli. At first, Madeline's expression didn't change. She leaned back, her fingers drumming against her knee. But as Evelyn continued, her posture stiffened, her hands clenched in her lap, and her face drained of color. She shifted forward, lips parting as though to protest, but no words came. When Evelyn closed the folder, the silence in the room pressed down on us. Madeline finally found her voice, brittle and sharp. This can't be right. I looked at her, my tone even. It is right. This is not revenge. This is recognition of the years I showed up, the years I was dismissed, and the values your father believed in. Her mouth closed again, and for once she had nothing to counter with. Connor shifted in his chair, avoiding my eyes. Judith reached for my hand under the table, her squeeze light but certain. Then Eli rose from his chair. He crossed the room without a word and wrapped his arms around me. His small body pressed into mine, warm and steady, and I felt the room tilt in a way no legal document could capture. When Evelyn dismissed us, I walked out into the bright afternoon light, knowing the weight had shifted, and that the days ahead would be marked by letters and numbers that told a different story. 3 days after the reading, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Addressed in Madeline's precise handwriting, I sat at the kitchen table, tea cooling in front of me, and read her words. It was a careful letter, typed rather than handwritten, each paragraph hedged with explanation. She wrote that she hadn't realized how distant she'd become, that she assumed I would always be there no matter how much space she carved out. She said she never meant to make me feel discarded, though every line sounded more like defense than apology. By the end, she asked if we could talk things through, as if decades of silence and dismissal could be folded neatly into a single conversation. I refolded the pages, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside the legal copy of Jonathan's will. Some words needed no reply. That same afternoon, the phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice introduced herself as the director of the Wake County Women's Shelter. She thanked me for the jewelry donation, her voice catching with emotion. At their gala auction, the pieces had raised over $18,000, enough to provide housing for 3 mothers and their children for half a year. I gripped the counter to steady myself as she spoke. The pearls my mother had once worn, the brooch my grandmother had pinned to her Sunday dress. These heirlooms now carried roofs over heads, beds for children, safety for women who had none. Jonathan's legacy was breathing again, not as ornament, but as shelter. When I hung up, I stood in the quiet kitchen, the late sun pooling across the floorboards, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, the numbers written into a will had turned into something more than inheritance. They had become life itself. I poured the rest of my tea into the sink, cold now, and thought of Eli, wondering if one day he would understand why I chose differently. It was a Friday evening when the knock came. I opened the door to find Eli standing there, backpack slung over his shoulder, hair falling into his eyes. Madeline sat in the car at the curb, engine running. She gave a quick wave but didn't step out. Eli asked softly, "Can I stay the weekend?" And before I could answer, the car pulled away. Inside, he dropped his backpack in the hallway like he had 100 times before. I made grilled cheese the way he liked, crusts trimmed, with tomato soup on the side. We ate at the kitchen table, and he grinned when I cut the sandwiches into triangles. Afterward, he rummaged through the bookshelf and pulled out The Monster at the end of this book. I read it aloud, hamming up the voices as I once had when he was little. His laughter rang through the house, bright and unguarded, and for a moment it felt like time had bent backward. Later, as I tucked him into the guest bed, he looked at me with an earnestness far too old for 10 years. "Grandma, do you still love Mom?" The question sat heavy between us. I smoothed the blanket over his chest before answering. "Yes, Eli. I do. I always will. But love isn't the same without respect. Sometimes grown-ups forget that." He was quiet for a while, then reached for my hand. I held it until his breathing slowed into sleep. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. The reconciliation I sought was not with Madeline. It was with myself, with the part of me that had waited too long for permission to matter. In the morning, as sunlight poured across the kitchen floor, I felt ready for whatever note or silence might come next. The garden had begun to stir again, buds pushing through as if nothing could keep them buried forever. I stood among the rose bushes Jonathan planted our first spring in Raleigh, shears in hand, the morning air cool against my skin. Their branches were tangled and scarred from winter, but stubborn in their reach. I clipped carefully, shaping what would bloom again, inside. The house no longer carried the same weight it once did. The mantel where Madeline's framed photos had stood now held one of my own watercolor paintings, clumsy, but mine. In the hallway, where Eli's school calendar had once hung as a reminder of events I was rarely invited to, I had pinned a letter I wrote to myself, simple words reminding me that presents did not require permission. Back outside, I cut a single rose, pale pink at the edges. I turned it in my hand, admiring how fragile it looked, yet how firmly it held its place. Years of frost had tried to wither it, yet still it returned. I carried it inside and set it in a chipped vase that had belonged to my mother. The imperfections of both vase and flower did not diminish their beauty. They deepened it. I stepped back, breathing in the faint scent of earth and bloom, and felt the quiet truth settle over me. I had not simply removed a name from a legal document. I had reclaimed the life that had always been mine to shape. Jonathan's promise still lived in me, but it no longer chained me to a silence I could not endure. And as the rose caught the afternoon light, I knew my story was no longer written in absence, but in choice, steady as spring after winter.